fiat currency, or maybe a bale of cotton backs it up. And, you know, some other people have gold to back up their currency, but my point is, you know, it was a risky business to accept someone else's currency, especially from another region altogether. So now we're going to move right on into the Civil War. Now that you've kind of had the stage set a little bit, and how complicated currency already was. Now, I do want to make the statement that in terms of the way that money changed the war, we're not going to get heavily into that because there's a lot of economics which we'll delve into with in the book that we're working on. The most important thing to say, though, is that counterfeiting was extraordinarily rampant. Some was sanctioned by the United States. As a matter of fact, there were people in Philadelphia that made money by selling Confederate money, and his name was Samuel Upton. And there was no law against it because the United States didn't recognize the Confederate States of America as a legitimate nation. So you could print all the money you wanted. It was just like Confederate money. Then they flooded the South. I've read that the Treasury supplied the paper and the ink to Upton. And so the more you flood the South with fake money, the more the inflation grows. And in my opinion, most of the war was lost because of money and inflation. No one could buy anything anymore. You couldn't afford to live. There's no way you could establish credit even as the Confederate States of America to buy more arms, more food, more anything. It was just paper. And if at the very end of the war, the paper was worth nothing.
Is that where the phrase "not worth the paper it's printed on" came from?
Probably.
Probably. Very good.
Yeah. And we'll get into the burning of the Confederate printing presses, and the last name is Cogswell, right?
That's right.
This is the
That
exciting
lawsuit
part.
is still pending.
And what about
Evans and Cogswell was the company that printed most of the Confederate money. And this gentleman may actually be related in some way. There we go. That's really pretty cool when you think
That is
about it.
amazing.
before you leave, you say the Treasury supplied the paper. Which Treasury was that?
Oh, the U.S. United States Treasury. Counterfeiting became a weapon of war, a very effective weapon of war.
It was practiced by both sides.
Oh, I know. But the North had some advantages, you have to admit. Not a lot of advantages, but some.
There were a number of Confederate sympathizers in the Treasury printing a fake Union currency.
Really?
And, well, so like you said, there's lots of different kinds of paper. So they would engrave it and then in the Treasury and then ship it out to Confederate spies who then printed it and made American money.
Got it. Got it.
The Treasury Department was a very curious place at that time.
All right. Now, I'm just going to do, this is just some highlights. We're going to talk about the two treasuries, North and South, at the beginning of the war, and just how much of an advantage the North had, it seems on paper anyway, in the beginning. I'm not saying that the South didn't have enormous resources and creativity, but I'm just saying the South had basically no treasury at the beginning. The United States had quite a substantial organization at the time. 3 of the U.S. mints in the South were held hostage. All 3 of them stopped producing money in 1861. 2 of them shut down permanently. The one in New Orleans didn't get started again until 1878, so it really did severely impact the capacity of the nation to produce money. There's a story about the really extremely rare Confederate States of America half-dollar, which is always worth talking about. There were 4 Confederate half-dollars produced in New Orleans in 1861. Jeff Davis did end up with one of them, which was taken off of his person at the time he was arrested by the North in 1865. But these stories, there are some other stories which I'll tell you about where those coins went, because most people didn't even know they existed until the mint reopened and they were doing some investigation in Congress and found out that these 4 coins were circulating, and they actually wrote to Jeff Davis and he conferred. He admitted is the right word that he had a coin on him and that the North took it off of his person. The Civil War tokens, oh man, that's a big story that Becky will take care of. And I love Civil War tokens. I mean, anybody and everybody in Norco could print their own cash to some extent. And there was something called a die sinker, the person that could produce those coins, and usually very closely affiliated with a jewelry company. The impact of the National Bank Acts, that's the most profound set of laws that came across in 62, 63, and 64 that created the national banking system, the capacity of the North to produce its own currency, outlawed the Civil War tokens in 1864, outlawed a number of things, and added In God We Trust for the first time in 1864. In God We Trust, like I said, has been up against E Pluribus Unum for a century. It's been competing to be the motto of the United States of America, and the two mottos coexist with each other now. But E Pluribus Unum was around, of course, since the beginning of the United States of America. And then what I call dead white presidents. Why is it that only non-living male individuals are on our currency today? Because of the Civil War, and because certain Treasury officials appeared on what's called fractional currency, which doesn't seem like any big shakes to me personally. A lot of living people had their pictures on currency, both North and South during the Civil War, but there are people in Pennsylvania that took objection to Treasury officials having their own picture on our notes. Passed a law in 1866 that said no living person, no likeness of any living person shall appear on our currency. Those laws are slowly changing now, but if you ever wonder why only Abe Lincoln and Alexander Hamilton and so on and so forth appear on those bills, it's because of the Civil War. Alrighty, now here's a story about how the whole thing got started. I'll try to make it quite as engaging as I know how. There were 5 locations, as we talked about. There were 3 in the southern states: Dahlonega, Georgia; Charlotte, North Carolina; New Orleans. But also, there were U.S. Customs houses in Savannah and New Orleans. That's where real money was collected. There was no Internal Revenue Service. So money was collected in terms of tariffs from the mercantile activity and the shipping industries down in New Orleans and Savannah and all along the coast. So when the South decided to take over the assets of the North, which they did, they had about $7 to $10 million in gold and silver in the customs houses. And there's a fellow by the name of P.T. Beauregard, which I think you guys have heard of in your Civil War history. He was actually running the custom house in New Orleans at the time. So the Fox knew the hen house very well. He knew where all the money was in New Orleans and how to confiscate it for the South. Now, this is how I'm going to get started with getting everyone prepared. This is the United States Treasury building as it appeared and does appear today. That version of it was built in 1836, and it was intended to be very imposing and tell the world that we're a very powerful nation, not unlike Rome, and that we have a very strong currency. And at the time of the Civil War, the West Wing was being constructed, and a regiment from Massachusetts was stationed in that building, and it was at the time considered to be the Site R, which means if the Confederates got into the city of Washington, that the White House and the cabinet were to evacuate into that building and be protected by Massachusetts troops. And it had very secure bunkers. It had all kinds of things built into it to be very secure. So it was literally a fortress. By the way, the South also started a treasury, and it looked something like that, according to, and I swear to you, this is true. I read an account, which I was trying to find for you guys, but I've done this, so, oh, here it is. I did find it. The chair and the desk, boy, in Montgomery, Alabama. And it says here, and I'll read it to you. The sad condition of the Confederate Treasury was evident from an incident which occurred a few days after it opened its meager office in a small room in Montgomery. There was a used desk, a few chairs, a rough mat on the floor that had been tacked there, and the identification plate on the door was just a small card on which someone had scrawled the name of the government department. So that's the way it was compared to what we in the North had as our Treasury building. But the story goes on to say that the assistant treasurer was sitting at the desk all by himself, and a soldier comes in with an order from Jeff Davis that says, it's a requisition order, says I need supplies for 100 troops. The guy reaches into his own pocket, pulls out $10 and says, here's what's in the treasury. That is the truth, that is the truth. So as things went along, the state of Alabama put money into the pot, and then of course, there was actually a transitional time between when the states seceded and when they joined the CSA. And that, like for example, in Louisiana, the state of Louisiana printed money with that printing press. I mean, a mint created coinage before it became the Confederate States of America. So it went from the United States of America to the state of Louisiana to the Confederate States of America. But that's the way the Confederate States of America started.
Does the coinage reflect that, those 3 stages, or?
It was all the same. They used the same dyes, and they
Okay.
actually had the same employees whom they kept there, they say, by force.
Mhm.
A few people were willing to sign a piece of paper, said that they were pledging their allegiance to the Confederacy. Others said, to hell with it, but whether you signed it or not, you had to stay and print money.
But the coinage wasn't newly engraved or anything?
No, except for those 4 half-dollars.
Okay.
Those really rare ones that they produced a few, and then they said, let's close the mint. We have no more silver and gold because England and France are demanding that we pay cash on the barrelhead for these weapons and these ships.
Ships, yeah.
They couldn't afford, had mints, then they had employees, they had everything they needed, but they had no silver and no gold anymore. It went right out the door. Is that fairly accurate from
Oh,
your?
I don't know that part.
Okay. So, let me see.
So Rick, just, did the Treasury move to Richmond when the capital moved to Richmond?
That's a great question, probably. I don't know that for a fact. But you
You
brought
could
up,
just put that in the back of the truck.
Cart,
right?
Card, yeah.
wagon.
Well, so as you can see, when the war broke out, there were 5 mints, and they're all in the north. Or, oh,